Communism is one of the largest and most controversial political ideologies in the modern world. It's been adopted in various forms by Cuba, China, and of course, the Soviet Union. But who developed the tenets of communism? Why has this form of government not been adopted more widely by Western nations? Hi, I'm Rich Burnett for Wondrium. In this episode of Perspectives, 5 experts use events from the last century to illustrate the development of communism, as well as its promises and pitfalls. We start now with a definition of communism and a picture of its reach in the 20th century.
Shortly after the Second World War, when communist regimes were at their peak, it's estimated that regimes espousing Marxism ruled over a third of the world. Even now, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and the transformation of China, it remains relevant, especially in places that still claim adherence to communist ideals like North Korea or Cuba. But more generally, much of what is happening in Eastern Europe today and in East Asia today are outcomes of the record and consequences of communism. How and why? At the outset, it is indispensable to define communism. Communism, as shaped by Karl Marx, is defined as the abolition of private property and a market which seeks profit, replacing these with a new system of collective control of the means of production and resources. Associated with this were promises of total social equality and sharing in a new kind of stage of human societal evolution. In fact, Marx's scheme promised a liberation from history, the entire record of struggle and exploitation and suffering to date. A later formulation of Marx's was that communism would be the stage when all of society was organized along the lines of one idea, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need.
According to Marx's labor theory of value, if people will buy the product of a worker's labor for $100, then that's what their labor is worth. When the capitalist only pays them $50 and then charges $100, so pays them only $50 for their labor but charges $100 for the product to make a profit on the sale, they're stealing $50 from the worker. And as competition increases, the exploitation will only worsen, monopolies will appear, and prices will rise, which while wages decrease, this will create more working poor and even fewer jobs. Wealth will concentrate in fewer and fewer people, while the poor will just get poorer and poorer and poorer, and eventually the workers will snap and revolt. This revolt will lead to communism in fairly short order, Marx says. First, the workers will take control of the government and purge capitalism from the system, making the government socialist. It will take over the production of goods and all industry. But the structure of that government will eventually just dissolve. There will be no more need for a leader or for elected officials because the people will take control of all political decisions and the economic life of the country directly. And when they do, they'll ensure that there will be no more worker exploitation, no more worker alienation, and certainly no more child labor. All credit and banking will be done by the state, as will all means of communication and transportation. Anyone who can work will, they might even do multiple jobs throughout the day, and the profits of all labor will be shared by everyone. In fact, there will be such an abundance that everyone will have access to what the labor of the workers produces. Everyone will be guaranteed income, free education, and free medical care. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's Marx's communism.
On July 16, 1918, several members of the Russian royal family, including a father, his wife, their 5 children and servants, were murdered by Bolshevik revolutionaries and dumped into unmarked graves. The royal family patriarch, Tsar Nicholas II, had actually been deposed months before his murder, ending 300 years of Romanov family rule. And now revolution was underway across all segments of society. The military, radical leftists, and elites, many of them fleeing. What would follow is the creation of a vast new state known as the Soviet Union. This was a major experiment that would test the communist theories of Karl Marx, as well as endless subsets of this experiment with such names as the Great Industrialization Debate, NEP, and their nadir, the Star Trials of the 1930s, in which brute force prevailed over collective aims or ideals. So the origins of the Soviet Union go back to a time when World War I had exhausted the Russian people and led to the deaths of millions of Russian peasants conscripted into the Tsarist army. Karl Marx left no detailed description of what a real functioning communist economy would look like. But he assumed that communism would first triumph in a modern, developed capitalist economy with sophisticated managers and literate, skilled workers. He certainly didn't envision communism starting in such a poor, backward, agricultural, and largely illiterate society as early 20th century Russia. Consequently, Vladimir Lenin and his fellow Russian Bolshevik communists had to more or less make up the new economic system on their own when they seized power. The Bolsheviks, who constituted the majority faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party that had seized power, decided on a system of direct control over the economy.
As you probably know, Marx's theory wasn't exactly vindicated in the long run. As Homer Simpson once said, "In theory, communism works. In theory." In reality, not so much. What went wrong? Well, first, it's well known today that his labor theory of value is wrong. Although, to be fair, it was the standard theory at the time. Smith accepted it as well. Much more than the cost of labor determines the value of a product's utility, supply and demand, and a host of other factors are also relevant. Otherwise, how does the price of oil fluctuate so consistently? What's more, Marx failed to take into account that capitalists are owed some compensation for their efforts. Not only do they do the legwork to create the business in the first place, but they take financial risks that workers do not. After all, there's no guarantee the product will sell. So, contrary to Marx's suggestion, charging more than it costs to make something does not always amount to theft, the kind of theft that he thought motivated and justified a worker revolution. More importantly, many of Marx's predictions were just flat out wrong. For example, he said communism would first arise in the most developed nations. It did not. The most famous communist revolution happened in Russia in 1917, when Russia's economy was extremely primitive. And most developed nations never saw a communist revolt at all.
History is full of surprises. In 1988, no one knew that the long Cold War was about to come to a sudden end. American universities were full of Sovietologists, while the CIA, Defense Department, State Department, and National Security Council all kept a close watch on events in Eastern Europe, Russia, and its satellite republics. They could see that the Soviet Union was no match economically for the West, that no one believed in communism anymore, and the decay, drunkenness, and disillusionment were widespread. They could see that a ruinous and failed intervention in Afghanistan had bled Soviet armies and prompted widespread desertion. They were, however, slow to recognize that Mikhail Gorbachev, Soviet premier since 1986, was not willing to use force to preserve the Soviet empire. President Reagan, while speaking at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate in 1987, had declared, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Just 2 years later, the wall did come down, amid scenes of rejoicing and reconciliation. East and West Berliners mingled freely for the first time since 1961. And before long, Germans from both sides were planning reunification.
When the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time from the top of the Kremlin, and the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation was raised in its place, no jubilant crowd stood shouting hurrah, however. No statues were ripped from their bases. No figure was burned in effigy. And no group of revolutionaries embraced the seemingly impossible as having been accomplished. Instead, newspaper reports described a sense of uncertainty, as a small group of onlookers watched this historic moment unfold. Some felt more than a little regret. One young woman told a reporter for the New York Times, "I'm sorry for the Soviet Union. I'm sad. I'm sorry a great country is falling apart before my eyes." As we now know, the transition from communism and the culture of a one-party state to capitalism and democracy would be exponentially more difficult than exchanging one flag for another. Communist apparatchiks didn't suddenly become liberal Democrats. They had a vested interest in maintaining their prerogatives of power and influence. Many had exploited the system and even pilfered from the state for years. Decades of economic atrophy, corruption, bribery, secrecy, and privilege access also lingered.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about the topics in this episode, the full list of series that these clips came from is in the description below. You can watch them all on Wondrium. And don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel for new episodes of Perspectives, and you can watch previous ones here.